Tourist Brian thought the white line was just decoration, and the Royal Guard was nothing more than a prop for his cheap show. A step over the line, a mocking splash of water at his feet, and the whole world suddenly froze. No one expected the guard to move. One step, one look, one sharp slash of the saber across the ground, and Brian realized he hadn't just crossed a boundary. He had shattered respect. But what happened next became not just a lesson for him, but a lesson for the entire world. Let's begin with the day tradition showed what true honor looks like. The screech of tourist bus wheels blended with the hum of voices and the clicks of cameras. The square in front of Buckingham Palace, as always, resembled a beehive where tourists, like tired bees, moved aimlessly in search of the perfect photo. Some, of course, tried to behave respectfully. They approached cautiously and kept their distance. But every day, there was always that one person who seemed to forget that tradition isn't a circus performance. Tall and imposing, Guardsman Michael stood at his post, motionless like a statue. His bearskin hat, black and massive, added to his monumentality. His bright red tunic fit perfectly. Not a wrinkle, not a speck. Amid all this chaos, he was silence in a world of noise. Even when the sun's rays, treacherously bright, slid across his face, he didn't move. For Michael, this post was more than just a job. It was duty, honor, and a memory of his grandfather, who had also served in the Royal Guard. "Hey, buddy!" A voice, like an axe against glass, pierced the air. From the crowd emerged Brian, a man in his 40s, wearing a ridiculous "I Love London" t-shirt, stretched so much it seemed the fabric itself was embarrassed by its owner. The massive backpack on his shoulders bulged as if he carried half of a souvenir shop with him. Brian thought he was the king of the moment. After all, he was a tourist, and tourists, as everyone knows, are the honored guests, wherever they go. "Dude, are you real?" he asked, stepping dangerously close. His hand waved in front of Michael's face as if testing whether he was alive. The guardsman didn't flinch, but the tension in his shoulders held a clear answer. "Step back, sir. Immediately." "Wow!" Brian laughed, turning to his buddies who were already poised with their cameras. "Guys, he's a robot. Seriously, not a single muscle moves. All right, let's see how far we can push this." Who even does this? You want to shout, dear reader, because it's obvious. Anyone who provokes a royal guardsman has long since lost their grip on reality. The crowd froze. Some turned away as if to say, "I don't know him," while others chuckled awkwardly. Yet there were those who looked at Brian with contempt. Among them was an elderly woman with her hair in a neat bun. "Absolutely no respect," she muttered, shaking her head. Brian basked in the glow of his own glory. To him, this was a show, and he was the star, while the guardsman was nothing more than a prop. "Come on, crack a smile, buddy. We pay taxes so you can stand here," he said, as though trying to joke. The crowd stirred even more. Palace security guards, stationed nearby, began exchanging glances. As long as Brian hadn't crossed the white line, they couldn't intervene. But it was only a matter of time. "Seriously, dude, stop it," someone muttered behind him. "Give him another minute," a girl with a camera smirked. "This idiot is definitely going to do something stupid." And they weren't wrong, because people like Brian don't have boundaries. In his mind, there was only one rule. I pay, so I'm in charge. Such tourists fail to understand that their money doesn't entitle them to trample on other people's traditions. Michael remained standing, showing no sign of irritation. He was confident. Discipline was his armor. Yet inside, something simmered quietly, because even the most steadfast soldiers sometimes tire of the endless stream of Brians. At that moment, the crowd began filming. Some hoped to capture a funny moment, while others sensed something important was about to happen. Brian, like many overconfident tourists, didn't know when to stop. Or to be more precise, he thought limits didn't apply to him. Somewhere in his mind, between fantasies of a show and his feeling of power, because tourists can do anything, right? A new plan was already taking shape. "Watch this," Brian declared, beginning to march clumsily, as if mocking the guardsman's stance. He extended his arm, jerked his shoulders awkwardly, and flashed a crooked grin. "Where's my sword? I'm a royal guard too." The crowd tittered, but less enthusiastically this time. An elderly man in a blazer with a Union Jack-pin pressed his lips into a thin line. A young couple with a baby stroller grimaced, and the woman whispered, "Oh my God, how embarrassing, like a child." Michael didn't move. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. Only the gaze hidden beneath the brim of his tall hat felt like needles against Brian's mocking shouts. Inside, where irritation boiled, he remained a rock. Because Michael was a guardsman, and a guardsman doesn't react. But Brian wasn't giving up. Why? Because people like him are convinced that if you dig deep enough into someone else's patience, you'll find a funny moment for a video. Then come the likes, comments, and questionable popularity among friends. Feeling the imagined approval of his mental audience, Brian took the next step. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a plastic water bottle. His grin widened even more. Maybe he's just hot. He's human too, right? Brian raised the bottle, as though musing aloud. "Don't!" The elderly woman's voice cut through the air like a blade. "That's inappropriate!" But Brian had already crossed the line, literally. He stepped forward, past the white line that any reasonable person would see as the boundary between acceptable and madness. "Cheers!" he shouted mockingly, splashing a few drops of water at the guardsman's feet. That was the second that split time into before and after. It was as though someone had pressed the pause button. The crowd froze. The air thickened, and the sounds of the square vanished. Even the birds on the palace roof fell silent, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The elderly woman's face contorted with indignation. "Are you insane?" Someone in the crowd whispered, "But he's a guardsman. He can't move, right?" The cameras were all pointed at Brian now. Hands trembled with anticipation. Maybe he'd finally get what was coming. And Brian, only smirking, took a step back, spreading his arms. "What are you all looking at me for? It's just a little water." At that moment, Michael moved. One single step forward, and the sound of his boot hitting the ground landed like a hammer blow. Majestic, sharp, and inevitable. Brian's smirk vanished. "Step back behind the line." Michael's voice was cold and impeccably clear. What? Brian stammered, stumbling backward like a boy caught stealing from the fridge. The crowd erupted into an awestruck. The people who had been holding back their frustration came alive. The elderly man in the blazer smirked and seemed to nod approvingly. "That's what he deserves," someone muttered. "He had it coming," cried a girl with her phone. "And Brian?" Brian froze, blinking stupidly, and glancing from the guardsman to the crowd and back again. It suddenly hit him that the show was over, and he was no longer the star. Michael stood as he had before, motionless, majestic, like the guardian of time. In his posture and voice was so much dignity that Brian looked like a pathetic fool beside him. And at that moment, it dawned on Brian. He had just lost. A second hung in the air, like a broken string. Brian, so used to being the main character, suddenly felt that his joke had gone too far. All eyes were on Michael. Even the wind seemed to quiet, afraid to disturb the silence before the storm. And then the guardsman moved. At first, it was a barely perceptible motion, as if the statue had come to life. But the next step struck like a gunshot in an empty room. Michael's boot, heavy and deliberate, hit the cobblestones. The crowd gasped. Brian's eyes widened, as if he'd only now realized what he'd done. Michael slowly raised his head. The eyes beneath the bearskin hat were cold, impartial, like the January fog. There was no rage in them, just a steely severity that cut Brian down without touching him. "Step back behind the line." Michael's voice tore through the silence like a knife through cloth. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The kind of voice that made you want to obey instantly. Brian stumbled back, as if he were facing not a man, but the embodiment of order itself. What? You spoke?" he stammered, but the confidence in his voice had vanished. Michael didn't respond. Instead, he moved, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient, drawing his saber from its scabbard. The metal glinted in the sun. The crowd held its breath. Someone whispered, "Is he going to strike him?" No. Michael's saber wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. With precision and care, he ran the tip along the ground, marking a line at Brian's feet. A boundary. A line that could not be crossed, physically or morally. "You've broken the rule. Step back behind the line or leave the premises." Michael's voice didn't waver. He didn't shout or threaten. He stated a fact that couldn't be argued with. Brian froze. The laugh that had been ready to escape his lips died in his throat. He looked back at his friends for support, but their faces weren't amused anymore. One pretended to film pigeons on the roof, while another nervously fidgeted with his camera strap. The laughter was gone. A voice rose from the crowd. "That serves him right." Another followed. "Shameful! No respect at all." "Did you see the way he looked at him?" whispered a girl with a phone, never taking her eyes off the screen. It seemed as if another second, and Brian might disappear into the ground from sheer embarrassment. But the moment was saved by the unexpected. From the crowd, weaving through the legs of adults, a little girl about 6 years old stepped forward. She clutched a plush teddy bear in her arms and looked up at Michael with such awe that time itself seemed to stop. "Are you a real knight?" she asked, her wide eyes fixed on the tall guardsman. The crowd held its breath again. Even Brian, it seemed, ceased to exist for a moment. Michael slowly lowered the saber, sliding it back into its scabbard. He bowed his head slightly, just enough to say, "Yes, I am." "Always," he said softly. Those words, spoken simply and confidently, hammered out the last traces of doubt from everyone present. The crowd burst into applause, not loud but sincere and respectful. People smiled, some shook their heads in admiration, and the elderly woman who had shouted "Don't" earlier dabbed the corner of her eye with a handkerchief. "You see," said the man in the blazer with the Union Jack, loudly and clearly, as though addressing everyone around. "They're not just decoration. These people stand here for us, for tradition. Respect their work." Brian stood at the center of it all, looking, to put it mildly, pathetic. His friends had vanished into the crowd, and he tried to play it off like it was all just an innocent joke. But no one was laughing anymore. Someone had already turned their camera on him, and the young man smirked as he said, "So, hero, how's it feel?" Brian didn't answer. He turned and, slumped under the weight of his own shame, began to push his way through the crowd. People stepped aside for him, as though afraid his foolishness might be contagious. And Michael? Michael resumed his position. Straight and composed, he stood at his post as if nothing had happened, as if a real knight had simply returned to his eternal watch. And you, dear reader, are probably thinking, that tourist deserved to get what was coming to him. But Michael hadn't punished him. He had simply shown where his boundary was. And now the whole world knew. Just moments ago, Brian had been proudly posing for cameras, but now he stood like a wet, defeated cat. The laughter of his friends had turned into silence, loud and judgmental. It felt as though the entire crowd, the whole of London, had turned to stare at him. "Sir," a security guard said firmly, stepping up to the offender. "You've broken the rules of the premises. You'll need to leave." What? I was just..." Brian tried to stammer out a weak protest, but his words drowned in the murmurs of the crowd. "You were just acting like an idiot," someone called from the side. "Completely lost his sense of decency," the elderly woman chimed in, still clutching her handkerchief. The crowd wasn't just watching, it was judging. Cameras kept recording, zooming in on Brian's every humiliated movement. Already someone was typing up a social media caption. "American tourist tries to mock Royal Guard. It didn't end well." Evening. The internet. A video with the headline, "Tourist crosses the line. Royal Guard shows him his place," went viral. The footage of Michael drawing the line with his saber spread across the world. On YouTube, thousands of comments flooded in. Not a single one in Brian's defense. Bravo to the guardsman, a true professional. Some people forget what respect for tradition means. Time for a reminder. That little girl was right. They're real knights. And somewhere, far from the noise of social media, life continued in the square in front of Buckingham Palace. Children laughed, tourists clicked their cameras, but no one dared cross the white line again. Michael stood at his post, unshakable as ever. He adjusted his bearskin hat and fixed his gaze on the horizon. Everything looked as if nothing had happened. "Good job, Michael," whispered a passing comrade. Michael said nothing, not because he didn't want to, but because a guardsman doesn't speak unnecessarily. His silence spoke louder than 1,000 words, because traditions don't crumble because of one fool. On the contrary, they grow stronger when there are people willing to stand for them. Let others think the guardsmen are mere decoration. Let them believe they're entitled to a show. A true knight never fights for recognition. He simply does his duty. Michael stood, and London remembered once more.